RStudio. In case you have an old version of RStudio, you might need to install Quarto CLI, which is at this website, quarto.org. And here you can find this presentation on our GitHub page, and I'll share it, I'll put it in the chat. And so this is the second event of RLadies Rome. My name is Federica Gazzelloni. I am one of the organizers of the chapter, and the other, along with Nina Deliu, and we are joined by Professor Min Çetinkaya-Rundel, who will be the speaker tonight. Hello, Min. And I'll say this a little bit in Italian as well, just for those of you who are following from Italy. So, benvenuti, questo è il secondo evento di questo gruppo RLadies Rome. Sono Federica Gazzelloni, una delle organizzatrici, insieme a Nina Deliu, e siamo in compagnia della professoressa Min Çetinkaya-Rundel, la nostra relatrice per questa sera. Tutto il materiale verrà condiviso durante la presentazione. Se volete potete dare un'occhiata alla documentazione relativa al quarto di cui parleremo. Tutto questo verrà poi condiviso con voi, quindi okay, let's go forward. What is RLadies? RLadies is a global organization with the mission of promoting the art language and for empowering women at all user levels by building a collaborative global network. It is a gender diversity friendly community founded in 2012 by Gabriela De Queiroz in San Francisco, and RLadies is now a worldwide organization with 206 chapters and more than 90,000 members globally. For more information, you can visit rladies.org. So what is RLadies Rome? RLadies Rome is a local chapter of RLadies Global. We will meet once a month about that. So we are still like setting up our mind how to do our talks frequency. So we will be talking about hot topics in the art language, and you are welcome to provide suggestions, comments, and get in touch to be part of this chapter.
All right. So let's get started. Thank you for the introduction, Federica. I will say that we're going to keep this as much of a sort of a live coding presentation as possible. And my camera is here, but the Zoom screen is over here for me. And I will sort of try to keep my eye on the chat. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in there. And if I don't, see it, we'll have a chance to sort of bring them back up at the end for the Q&A. But I'm also happy to sort of clarify something as I go. And I think that it'll help us keep things as sort of interactive as possible, which probably is even more important for those of you joining from Europe, where it's even later in the day, so you're not just listening to me talking. So I am going to start by acknowledging that Quarto probably means something to you if you are a native Italian speaker and you're not too far off in terms of what it is. Federica, could you allow me to share my screen? All right, so we'll do this. Give me 1 second to rearrange my Zoom windows now that that happened. All right, so this is where the name Quarto actually comes from. I'm not going to go too far into what it is, but it actually does come from this booklet that is basically sort of folded in fourth, and that's where I got the little image from. So what I'd like to do today is I'll actually start with an empty RStudio project and GitHub repository. And in a few minutes, I will share a link with you in terms of where I am if you want to follow along and code along with me. And if not, and you just want to watch, that's perfectly fine as well. So to get up to this point, I've installed the latest version of RStudio. And I've also grabbed the latest version of Quarto from the Quarto website, but as Federica mentioned, RStudio does come bundled with it. One of the nice things about Quarto is that you don't necessarily have to be writing code in R, and you don't need to be using RStudio as your editor. So I will say a few things about that towards the end. And if that's of interest to you, I'm happy to sort of answer questions, but I want to sort of give you a glimpse of how I tend to use Quarto, which is using RStudio and writing primarily R code. So I'm going to start by creating a new Quarto document. So let's go ahead and do that. I've gone to File, a new Quarto document. And once the document launches, let's give it a title, maybe my first Quarto document. And I am going to keep the output HTML. I'll show you in a second how to get a PDF output as well. So I'm going to keep this as HTML. I am using the knitr engine. This is where this idea of using Quarto primarily with something like Python might come into play, where if that was the case, you would want to use the Jupyter engine, but I'm going to keep that as knitr. And I am going to use the visual markdown editor as well. So instead of writing in plain text markdown, we are going to write using a system where basically things look a little bit more, in my opinion, like Google Docs, for example. So here's my document. And before we do anything, let's go ahead and render this document. And let's call this document hello.qmd. You will see that in the document, I have on top some metadata about my document. That's the YAML of my document that, when rendered, basically translates to this nicely formatted title. Then I have some headings like Quarto and running code. And these headings I can navigate through using the document outline, and they are represented on my output as well. Any code that I have, I can run it in place, and I can get my output, in my console, for example, or within my document, or I can basically see the output in my rendered document. And I can do things like hiding code chunks, for example, using some code chunk options that we'll get into in a second. So this is a basic Quarto document. So let's go ahead and start making some modifications to sort of make it our own. First, we're going to stay primarily on HTML land. Our output will be HTML, but before we go sort of too far into that, let's go ahead and talk about what if you need a different output format. If that is the case, the item that you would adjust is the format field. So we're going to turn that to PDF instead. And I'm going to go ahead and render my document. And we'll see that the document basically gets rendered in the RStudio viewer as well. Some of you might use your RStudio in a way where when you render a document, the output pops up. I like using it where I can see it in my viewer tab. And this might be helpful to demo, even though it's not Quarto specific, that if I actually click on this little gear icon, I can choose to preview in viewer pane, which is how I like to keep my RStudio settings, or I can choose to preview in a new window, would create a pop-up window for me. All right, so we're going to leave it there. You can see that I can create a PDF document as well. And if I do, that would be stored as a PDF document on my in my files pane. RStudio has this bug where the last document gets repeated sometimes. So let's go ahead and delete this PDF. I'm going to abandon that for a second, and I'm happy to answer questions about PDF outputs later if we want later. But let's keep things as HTML and do a few things. So one of the things that we saw was that we are able to, using the chunk option echo, which if you're an R Markdown user, even if you're new to Quarto, you might be familiar with, I can hide the code from my rendered document, which might be ideal if you're working on, say, a data analysis and you're writing a report that you want to share with somebody who's only interested in the results and not the code itself. You can see that I have two separate code chunks here, though. And if I wanted to hide both of them, one thing I could do could be to say, okay, let's add this code chunk here too. I could do, instead of, if I have many code chunks in here, could be to say that I want to make some, define some options for execution. And you can see that there's really nice sort of YAML completion when editing Quarto documents in our studio. So as soon as I start typing exec, it shows for me what my options are. And then I can say, I want, for example, all of my code cells to be echo false. And let's go ahead and render that for a second. And so in my rendered document, none of my code shows. You can see here, both of the code chunks are hidden, and all of my output shows. Let's try a few more things. So I'm going to sort of take a little bit of a path away from just simply speaking about Quarto and highlight a few things about the visual editor, which I think particularly for editing Quarto documents is a really nice sort of way that you can do that. So let's go ahead and, for example, do something like load a package. So how about we sort of start from the beginning? I am going to delete some of this stuff, and we can start with perhaps a new analysis. And my analysis is going to be on the much beloved Palmer penguins data set. So what I can do is I can start writing a header. And in order to do that, I have a few options. As you can see in gray here, it says type / to insert a block. So I'm going to use the insert anything tool to say I want maybe a second level heading that says data. And then maybe I can type something like my data come from the Palmer penguins package. And in order to maybe bold the package name, I can either use the sort of the tools that are provided in the editor, or I can use shortcuts like Command B. I can also say that I maybe want to insert a hyperlink. So let's go to the website for Palmer penguins and copy that URL. And I can go ahead and also insert a hyperlink. You can see that there's a little icon here, and I can put that link there. And let's go ahead and render this document. So at this point, what I'd like to do, maybe let's do one more thing. Let's add a code chunk. So I'm going to insert an R code chunk. I'm going to label that code chunk, load data. And let's say library, oops, go away. Palmer penguins. You can see that for my code chunks, I am using in order to indicate my chunk options, I'm using the hash sign followed by the pipe. So in short, we call that the hash pipe. And each code chunk can now go into its own line. Let's go ahead and load my any other packages that I might need as well. So I'm going to just quickly load the tidyverse package as well. And then the one other package that I'm going to use in my demo is the GT package for making a table. So these are the 3 packages I load. I happen to know that the tidyverse is a bit chatty when you load it. So another thing I might do is add a code chunk option like message false. So you can see that I'm using my tab to do the tab completion. Now at this point, if you would like to follow along, I'd like to share the document with you. So let's go ahead and render this document one more time. And what I am going to do is, maybe let's delete this, that might be around from before. And let's render this one more time. And I'm going to push this document to this GitHub repo that I've set up for this presentation, and I'll share that link with you quickly. let's go ahead and push this, and let me share the link with you on Zoom. Here we go. And let's take a look at this document on GitHub real quick. I'm going to open this hello.qmd file. And if you are an R Markdown user, this sort of text should look pretty familiar to you. You can see that it is in plain Markdown. So I had bolded the text Palmer penguins, and I can see the sort of the syntax I would use for bolding. I had entered a hyperlink, and I can see the syntax for adding a hyperlink to a Markdown. In fact, I can go to the editor, the source editor here, and see that same thing locally in my RStudio window as well. Now, what is basically happening is that the visual editor gives me a nice sort of modern authoring experience where for, what I'm going to call minutia, like making italics or underlining things, I don't need to sort of worry about remembering Markdown syntax. But ultimately, the document I'm creating is not some binary file like a Word file. What RStudio is doing is, as you make these choices in terms of your styling, it is actually translating them to plain Markdown under the hood, and therefore your files are entirely trackable by Git. So we're getting sort of the what you see is what you get sort of authoring experience without letting go of the plain text sort of spirit in a way that can be checked into version control. Any questions so far before we sort of highlight more features of Quarto? All right. Looks like so far so good. Okay, so let's do a few things. What are some things that tends to be annoying in plain Markdown? For me, one of the things is inserting images. I sort of never now remember how exactly to insert an image. So one nice thing I can do with the visual editor is I can say, here, let's look at some of this beautiful art from Allison Horst, and let's go ahead and maybe copy this. So I'm going to say copy image, and I can simply paste it into my document. And I can render it, and I will be able to see that image has been inserted into my document. And if I feel like that is ginormous, what I can do is I can change the size easily here. So I don't need to remember the sort of the HTML syntax for doing this. I can change the center. I can add a caption to it. 3 species of penguins. And very nicely, I can also add an alternative text to it that will be visible, that will be accessible by screen readers. So I could say something like illustrations of 3 species of penguins, chinstrap, gentoo, and Adelie. And I can even add a link to it. So why don't we go ahead and link to over here and add all of this information. And let's go ahead and render this. It's available in my rendered document. And if I switch back to the source code, I can see that sort of the right syntax has been applied to it, but I didn't have to remember how to do this myself, which is pretty neat. There's a question in the chat from Marville asking, why do we need to label the code chunks? Really good question. And the answer is you don't have to label the code chunks, but there's a pretty good reason to do so. So let's go ahead and add one more code chunk. So I am going to say, insert another code chunk. And I'm going to not label this code chunk. And let's say that I want to do 1 minus 2, but as you can see, I made a little typo here. Okay, and let's go ahead and try to render this document. So it basically tells me what the issue is a little bit, but it is not telling me. Over here, as you can see, it says unnamed code chunk 2 is the one where the error is, right? It is not, if I have a label for my code chunk, it will show it there. And if you can imagine that if you have a pretty long document, that could be pretty handy to know the label, especially if you've taken care to label them informatively. Another nice thing is if you have many code chunks, you can see those that are labeled will be visible here in the sort of the chunk outline in a way. And it allows you to sort of jump between your document easily. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. So it is absolutely optional, but it can be really helpful. Let's think about one more reason why it might be helpful to do so. And this will be a good reason to sort of talk about another feature in Quarto. Oh, good question. When I pasted the image, does the program save the image in my directory? In this case, yes, it does do that. So let's go ahead and take a look. It created a folder called images, and in it, it gave a random name to my image. If I wanted, I can rename this image. Like if I want my image files to be nicely named, I think it might be good practice to do so. But it will create sort of a name for it that doesn't overwrite an existing one. Yeah. Let's go ahead and add a figure to our document. So I am going to say the bar plot below shows the distribution of 3 species in the data set. And let's go ahead and insert a code chunk. And let's say that we are going to make a ggplot of penguins, where on the x-axis, I want species and I want a simple geom bar, for example. All right. Now, in this text, I have used text like the bar plot below. Generally, that is not very good practice. If you are going to be referring to text, it makes more sense to refer to it with something like figure 2 below, because, you know, especially if this is rendered to different formats, that bar plot may not always be underneath it, or you might have lots of text in between. So what we can do is we can add a label to our plot, say label, and it will need to start with fig or figure. And we'll say species bar, for example. And let's go ahead and save our document. And another thing I will do is I will say I want to add a caption to it. So fig cap is going to be bar plot of species of penguins with the most common being Adelie, then Gentoo, then Chinstrap, for example. Okay. And it's nice to sort of format our code a little bit so that, you know, things aren't running off the line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bar here, and let's go ahead and make these so that it's a little bit easier to read them. And also when we push this code to GitHub, that things are formatted nicely. Okay, so right now I have a figure that has a label that starts with fig, and I also have a caption for that figure. So the one thing now I need to do is we are going to be referencing this plot. So instead of bar plot below, I can say that I want to insert a cross-reference. So let's go ahead and say that I want to insert a cross-reference. And you can see that my figure is already selectable for me. And this is happening because I have the label that starts with fig dash, and I have a caption for it. So let's go ahead and select this and render the document. And we'll see that it labels it numbers it automatically. So if I add another figure earlier, it will make it figure 2, and it allows me to cross-reference to it. And Shante, to answer your question, yes, it will. So I can actually convert this to PDF now, and the same syntax will work for example, cross-referencing. There are certain things that work only in HTML and not in PDF, and vice versa. One of the things, for example, is if you have tab sets, for example, in your document, anything that requires interactivity doesn't work, but you can see simple things like figure numbering actually do. And same with Word documents as well. Yeah, we can also import this to export to a Word document as well. So that's a docx is the format. And I think I have Word installed on this computer. Yeah, there we go. Where are you, Word document? There we go. So we can see that everything is working in the Word document too. All right, so let's go back to HTML and let's show one more thing. So we have added a caption, but we can also add alt text to our computer generated figures as well. So fig alt in this case should be something that's a little bit more informative than just the caption, because it's supposed to be for someone who is not able to see the plot. So maybe I might take something similar to the caption. I don't want to repeat everything, but I might add something like there are 150 RLadies. I can't remember what the numbers were. Let's run everything over. What is this? Maybe roughly 60 chin straps and roughly 125 gentus or something like this. And let's go ahead and render this, and we'll see that this alt text doesn't actually show up on our output because it is not meant to be visible necessarily in output. However, if I was to go into inspect this element, I'll be able to see, I may need to move things a little bit. I'd be able to see that this got, where are you? This. Sorry, I'm not finding the right item for some reason. Maybe if we just pop this out to a new document, that'll be a little easier to see. Okay, we can basically see that this actually gets recorded as alt text for that document as well. So the chunk options make it really easy for us to sort of get everything that we need, as well as, you know, help us make the document that we're creating do better in terms of accessibility as well. Now let's do one more thing in terms of the HTML document, and that's going to be creating a table and cross-referencing a table as well. I can say in the table below, we see the first 6 penguins from the data set, for example. And I can add another R code chunk where I say that I want to take the penguins data set and then slice head n equals 6, let's say, and then I want to make a GT table out of this. So this is maybe what my table looks like. Similar to this with the figures, I am going to want to label, except I will use the suffix TBL for table. And I will need a caption. That's the that start with TBL as well. So first 6 penguins in the data set. And let's go ahead, instead of saying in the table below, let's go ahead and insert a cross-reference where I am actually referencing this table. And let's go ahead and render our document. All right, so here's our table as well. And what I'll do at this point is I will get rid of this PDF file and the docx file one more time. And we'll go ahead and push these changes one more time in case folks are wanting to see what the code looks like so far. And once again, the code is over here, this repo. Okay, so there are a few other things that we're going to talk about. The next thing I wanted to demo is slides. But before I get into that, are there any questions in terms of either what we covered or other functionality that you're curious about? All right, then maybe let's switch it. Yeah, go ahead.
There is a question. I don't know if you see it's this syntax for HTML products, or does it work cross output options?
Yeah, so indeed, the same syntax, we can change the format to PDF, docx, or whatever we want, and the same syntax will work. That's not true for every single thing that we can do, but it is true for much of it. A good place also to go to as a reference, so this is a good time to sort of bring up the Quarto documentation / the Quarto website. If you go to reference, and then within reference, we can select different output types, as you can see. So we can select HTML. And this tells me all of the possible, YAML fields, including code execution options that we can have that will work in HTML. So for example, let's try one that might not work in another format. Let's try code fold. So what I'll do is I will add code fold true here. And let me go ahead and render this. And let's get rid of this so that our code is actually showing to begin with. And you can see that the code chunk is folded by default, and I can play around with it. So what would happen if we change this to a PDF document? In a PDF document, we lose interactivity, basically. All right, you can do it. So you can see that things didn't fail, but also we've lost that functionality. So yes, your code does work across formats, but if the option you're trying to use is not feasible in that format, it generally gracefully fails, where it goes back to a default that makes sense for that output format. Does that answer the question about sort of going across document formats? All right, maybe while we're at this, I will show one other code chunk option that I personally very much enjoy being able to use as an educator. And that is, so we've talked about echo false for turning code off. There's another option that we can use, echo fenced. And what this will do is it will actually print out the actual chunk along with the options as well. So this used to be quite a bit of a pain to get, like if you're teaching where you want to teach to your students, or you want to have like on your course slides what a code chunk actually looks like, you would have to like fake it and put it in a plain markdown chunk. Now we actually have working code, so we haven't actually sort of taken away the code functionality, but we're actually printing it there. And as you can see, it will smartly omit the eco-fenced option, because that's not the one you want to show your students. Everything else is. All right, now what I'm going to do is let's add a few section headers. So we have our data. Maybe I will call this species, and then I will call this penguins. Whoops. Heading 2, penguins. So you can see I'm populating my document outline. And let's do a bit more here. Let's also say that I'm going to have a first level heading that's like introduction. And then maybe I might have a second level heading where I have something like analysis. And I won't actually do this, but I will add a slide like model results or something. And you can imagine that I had some results there. So you can see in my document outline, I'm starting to develop a nice sort of outline here. It's sometimes handy to have that outline on your rendered document as well. So we can easily do that by adding another option under HTML. Let's go ahead and say we want the table of contents to be true. So now in my HTML document, I can actually easily jump between these various section headings that I have. In addition, now that I have some nicely partitioned document, making slides becomes pretty easy. So I can go and say, I don't want an HTML document anymore. I want a Reveal.js document. And let's go ahead and render that. And now my document has been converted to a slide deck with a title being the title slide, the first level headings being a section heading. So we can see that sort of very similar outline here. And then second level headings being slide headings. So going between, again, talking about basically going between formats becomes pretty simple. We can see something like a common issue here, which is that now things that were pretty wide that worked in a document don't work very well in a slide deck. So it's not perfect. You still might need to do some adjustments. One of my favorite things is oftentimes you can get away with editing a slide deck. I'm going to click on these little 3 dots here and add the dot smaller class that's available by default. I have not written any custom CSS here. And let's go ahead and try rendering. Oftentimes that's sufficient to sort of get everything into a single slide. So you can see things are fitting a lot nicely. They're still not perfectly fitting, but you probably don't want that wide table in your slide deck anyway. So that's a very quick example of going between slides. You can think of some things that tend to be pretty persnickety. All right, let's reload this. Pretty persnickety in terms of getting things correct on slides. Some of these things are adding columns. That's pretty easy. So all I've done is I have used the Insert Anything tool again. And because now I'm working with slides, columns is something that I can pick. Another thing I will show is, let's go back to where we had this bar plot. So let's go back to our species. And you can see that I have the code that I have is gone. By default, reveal.js will hide the code, assuming that you're presenting something you probably don't want to show the code. But let's go ahead and bring the code back on, assuming maybe you are trying to teach some coding. So I'm going to say echo true, and let's render this document. So now I have some code and my figure. What can we do to make matters a bit worse? I am going to do a few things here. So I might say that I want another theme. I might say that I want to have some new x-axis, some new y-axis, some title, maybe a subtitle. Oops. All right. Now, if I have all of this and I have a bunch of, oh, I am missing a comma. I have a bunch of code on my slide, you'll see that my figure is going to get squished to be pretty tiny and not very useful for me. So this is not looking very good, right? How do we sort of control this? We could play around with figure sizes and stuff, but a really nifty feature is to say that we want the output location to be column. And what Quarto will do automatically is put your code in one column and your figure in the other column, making it a lot easier to see. In fact, I could do something like column fragments. So fragments are how we add sort of animation, is I think the term that's used in PowerPoint or Keynote for it, where as I'm scrolling through the slides, so I arrive here and then my plot is shown on the next slide. So I can scroll through, and this is the other columns that we had inserted. I will demo just one last thing, but if there are any questions about the slides, this would be a good time to ask. Otherwise, I'll finish my demo and open it up to a much wider Q&A. And while we do that, how about I prep? So I am going to do a couple things here. Let's say that these are my slides.qmd, because that's what we had turned it into. And then let's open up. Those are the slides. We'll leave that as reveal.js. And for hello QMD, I am going to bring this back to format HTML. And let's go ahead and render it to make sure that things work. All right. And we're going to add one more document. I am going to add a document called my first Quarto website. And it will be an HTML document. And I want to save that document as index.qmd. So that's really the only special thing I'm doing. That's index.qmd. One of the things I like the source editor for is to be able to easily select a bunch of text to delete them. And, let's say homepage for the website. So we'll just leave it very simple. So our goal is to make a website with 3 pages in it, basically. Let's go ahead and close these documents. I have those 3 pages here for myself. I'm going to get rid of any other output from earlier and just delete them for now. And I am going to create a new text file. And I'm going to call that text file _Quarto.yml. So that's sort of what I'm creating here is a Quarto project. This is a project where the type is website. And in this website, I have, let me try to, the title is going to be maybe Quarto website. And then I will have a nav bar where on the left side, I might want to have a few things. So I'm going to say index.qmd. What else did we have? Hello.qmd and slides.qmd. I think that's enough for now. And the last thing that we're going to do is say that we want this to be HTML, right? Maybe I can just leave it as this HTML. Okay. Finally, I'm going to relaunch my RStudio project. So I'm going to my project viewer and I am going to say that I want to relaunch this project. That was the name of my project. Yes, we can quit and relaunch. And you can see that I gained a new tab in RStudio, a build tab. In this build tab, I have a new button called render website. So let's go ahead and render this website. And here is my web page. Before I browse around in it, why don't I go ahead and commit my changes in case, again, anyone wants to go back to the repository that I shared earlier and wants to browse the code a little bit more easily. Let's pop this out. And we can see that I have 3 documents. One I had titled my first Quarto website. One I had titled my first Quarto document. And then the other one was the same title, but was my slides, basically. So all it takes to create a website, and this could also be a book as well, though we would then want to define chapters as opposed to a navigation bar. But all it takes to create a website is having this Quarto YAML file where you explicitly say what things you want to bring together. And we can obviously do a little bit better. We could say this is home. We could say this is a report. And we could say this is slide, so that we actually give them, slightly nicer names. We'll go ahead and render the website again and take a look. So in the short amount that we've had so far, we have talked about single documents, and we've shown how we can do cross references in them. We've talked about slides, going from a single document to a slide, and we've talked about Quarto projects, where you can bring multiple documents together using a YAML file to create a website. Hopefully there's enough here to sort of get you started with Quarto. And if you are an R Markdown user, many things probably felt very much at home. They work very much like how things would work with in the R Markdown universe. One difference is that to go between different formats, like a document to slides to website, we did not rely on new R packages. We continue to rely on the Quarto command line interface. And so because we're not relying on different packages, we're not having to change a whole lot between our documents in terms of our syntax. For example, I didn't explicitly need to add slide breaks to my document. I could just rely on the existing section headers. There's obviously a lot more to learn about Quarto. The Quarto website is a great documentation website, perhaps almost like an overwhelming amount of documentation as you're getting started. But if you are genuinely just starting to dip your toes in Quarto, the place I would recommend getting started is the Get Started page, where you can select the tool that you use. So if you're an RStudio user, you would probably choose this path. But if you prefer to write code in VS Code or Jupyter Notebooks or Vim Editor or any other text editor, there are pathways you can take as well. And then you'll see sort of walking through sample examples, taking control of your computations and sort of learning about authoring as well. If you have already played around with Quarto a little bit and you are looking to do a bit more, the guide might be a better place for you to go, where you can jump immediately into, oh, I want to make slides, so I'm going to look under here, or I want to make a website, or I want to write a book, or I want to embed shiny or observable widgets in my document. So I would recommend going there. And finally, I find that the reference site is really helpful for those times where you're thinking, what was the name of that code chunk option, for example? Or is it possible for me to add a table of contents? The website, just like any Quarto website you might make, this website is made with Quarto as well, as you can imagine, and has really good search. So I can start searching for something like TOC for table of contents, and I can see pretty easily under which format options it appears. So I may not even necessarily have to go to the help page even to find that out. And finally, I'll draw your attention to the gallery. Whether you're just getting started and you want to know what's possible, or you've done quite a bit, but you want to know, how can I make like beautiful visualizations, or write a pretty impressive sort of slide deck using Quarto. You can see sort of a sample slide deck here from Emil from the Tidy Models team. And the nice thing is that you'll be able to see the code associated with each of these as well. So it becomes really easy to sort of learn from others. So in the gallery, there are examples of slide decks, single documents, websites, and books too. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to demo other things or answer any sort of high-level questions.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please jump in.
Yeah, so one of the questions is from Savannah. What would you say are the advantages of using Quarto instead of Blogdown for a website, or instead of Bookdown? I wouldn't necessarily say that there are advantages in the sense that, like, if you have one already working, I don't think there is a reason to just stop and update it, other than if you want to learn about Quarto. However, I think one of the big advantages, as we just showed, is that if you are just building stuff up now, it might be advantageous to start building there, because as you saw, we never mentioned the word Hugo, for example. When you're building a Blogdown site, you do need to learn about this system called Hugo, and you sort of can't circumvent learning about it a little bit. You don't have to be an expert at it, but you certainly need to learn sort of one more thing to make sure you're troubleshooting everything well. Versus with Quarto, all you needed to learn was Quarto and how to write single documents, and then you can put them together with a single YAML file. Similarly with Bookdown as well, instead of learning new syntax, which there is a little bit of new syntax between R Markdown and Bookdown. For example, how you do cross-references or how you do citations can be different. Here, sort of everything is single. Other potential advantages, if you're a person who codes in multiple languages, so you want to have both Python and R in your project, that might be another reason to do so. And I'll show one other reason, particular for websites and books, why this might be helpful. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. Something we didn't get into this time was talking about sort of computation time, for example. Do you want your computation to run every time you render your website? Right now, it does do that. But what we can do is we can add an execute option called freeze, where you can set true, where it never reruns your computation unless you explicitly say it to do so. You can say false, where it always reruns it, or you can say auto, where it only reruns the code if you've touched the document where the code is in. So by, freezing things, we can make sure that when I hit render website, it's not constantly rerunning my code. Or if I'm sometimes working on this project in an environment that has Python but not R, or vice versa, I'm not getting bogged down by it. That feature, freeze feature, doesn't in the same spirit exist in Blogdown or Bookdown, so that could be another reason to go that direction. Thank you. Another question from Serena is that for collaborating, Quarto is great, but that you might need a GitHub account for doing so. Is there a way to collaborate with Quarto with people who don't use R or GitHub? So yes, in a way, yes, there. So GitHub is definitely not necessarily a requirement for collaborating with Quarto. It's generally a good way for collaboration. I think that's simply what it is, because you have the notion of a repository that multiple people can see, or if you allow multiple people can push to. There isn't the equivalent of something like, so if you're, I don't know, Serena, what your background is, but if you're coming from like the academic land where you write scripts, you might know of Overly, for example, where you can do collaborative editing of LaTeX documents, or many of you have probably used Google Docs. There isn't the equivalent of that necessarily for Quarto, but you can imagine sort of putting this Quarto document anywhere. So if you have some sort of shared network that you collaborate on, or Dropbox, in order to open and edit a QMD file, one does not need to have R, RStudio, anything like that installed. So if you have a colleague who, for example, would like to edit this plain text file without touching any of the code, or maybe if you don't have any code in here, you could certainly sort of have this be saved on anywhere that doesn't even have R necessarily, unless you're rendering code, and you could collaboratively edit. Why might you do that? Maybe you have a project where there's a bunch of writing and you have some collaborators who, just are going to be helping out with the writing. And if they are so inclined, and if they're not going to be R users and there's no R code being run here, they could use the terminal and simply, instead of using the build tab, write Quarto render and basically get the same result. So I'm showing this in RStudio because that's what happened to be in front of me, but I could just be using the terminal from my computer as well. And it basically will create the site and create an, index.html file for me. Does GitHub make collaboration easier? Yes. Learning GitHub isn't the easiest thing, but once you have, I think it is a great place for collaboration, but it's certainly not the only option, and definitely not a requirement for Quarto specifically. You're welcome.
I don't see any other questions. I might have one. So what if so basically my question is about it's a bit more like it's about citations. Okay, so Quarto is really great for this. So and as in your talk at our studio conference, you explained, you and Julie, very well all these features about citation and everything. So, but my question is, so if I make a book, for example, Quarto, and then it automatically creates like those files, like references, and then references.bib.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I can like populate my reference.bib if I have, for example, Zotero, and like with the citation, I just do the @ sign and then select my the citation that I want to mention. Then this populates the bib file, but then what's happened to the other file? So the reference is not, how can I like manage the reference file to be nicely with all the references from the bib file, nicely written?
So if I'm understanding correctly, let me, so you indeed can link up your Zotero with your sort of for your reference management. So if we go to preferences or global options, where do we, oh no, not here, sorry. So let's go ahead and say that we want to add in the visual editor, I want to insert a reference here, insert a citation, sorry. So you can see you can add Zotero here as well. And then, so I don't have Zotero hooked up here. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to cheat for a second and bring in this paper from this DOI. Oh no, that's the package. Come on. Where do I find the paper? There's a, here we go. So here is the DOI for the original Palmer Penguins paper. So I can look this up and I can say that I do want to cite it. And when I insert it, as you said, it creates a references.bib. So this file, if you only use that tool to insert references to your document or your book, it will only include the ones that are being cited. And as soon as you render the document, it should be adding to the end a section called references that pulls all of that information in. So the references.bib file will include sort of any of the anything that you are referencing, but if it's not being referenced and you just add it there, then it's not going to be rendered. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There's one more question. Orville asks, I'm wondering if you also compute your grades and make grade reports with Quarto. No, I have not made grade reports with Quarto. I do use R to calculate my grades. Oftentimes I end up just sort of like writing them to a spreadsheet for me to sort of look through. So I don't generate sort of like a dashboard view for my students. I very well could, although, if, I usually look at my grades all together, but for my students, I obviously couldn't like show them each other's grades. So the idea of reporting with Quarto to them, that would mean that maybe I create individual reports with sort of their progress or something like that. It's not something I have done, but there is an option to sort of create multiple documents with inputs with Quarto, just like with parameterized reports. So that could be the sort of thing that's possible. But I haven't done that myself. I've not had a need for it. And I don't know where you teach, if you teach Orville or where you teach, but I know that in some countries, they'll just like post people's grades outside of a door and everyone sees each other's grades. You can't do that in the US. So that's probably why I've not had a use for it. All right, well, thank you for all the questions. I hope this was useful to folks for, either getting started or sort of taking the jump to making something new with Quarto. Maybe one last thing I will mention is if you go to the Quarto website, there's a little button on top called Help, and you'll see that it links to the issues on GitHub if you're reporting a bug, but there's also a discussion forum. And I encourage you, if you have questions, even if small, the discussion forum is a great place to ask them without having to worry about, is this a bug or is this a question? Oh, there's one more question. Is it possible to render at once a HTML and docx version of a file? Yes, however, not from the RStudio IDE right now, but instead, if you do Quarto render in the terminal and you write multiple outputs, it will render them at once. Yeah. Vilma, yes, you can embed Shiny apps in a Quarto document similar to R Markdown. And if they are embedded apps, like if the code is actually in there, then your Quarto file would have to be hosted on a Shiny server for others to be able to interact with it. Or if you have the Shiny app embedded elsewhere, just like with R Markdown, you can iframe it in as well. And then your Quarto file can be hosted anywhere. You're welcome. I think we've managed to cover all the questions. You're welcome. Thanks you for joining.
Okay, thank you very much. So you can have a look at the meetup, the GitHub repo for RLadies Rome. There you find all the information, like the YouTube channel, where this video will be posted in, and then all the other information about the materials for the from the talks, and everything you might be interested in. We thank you a lot for coming today, and thanks Min for your wonderful presentation. Please get in touch if you like to propose a talk, if you like to talk, you like to take part of like volunteering things, if you have any questions. And I think it's everything for tonight. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next for the next RLadies Rome event.